Okay, so we're going to start the series off with the basic document markup that we have here. All we've got is just a form here, and if you're familiar with basic HTML, this will make complete sense. We're basically posting all of the data that we've contained within this form element to index.php, and that's under the post method. So that means that we can pick this up in PHP using the post superglobal that we saw in the introduction video. And we've got the username, email, and password fields here that we can access within that. And then obviously this submit button down here just posts that all through to index.php. So it sends an HTTP request with this information. We can just basically go ahead and pick this up in PHP. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be requiring everything in and instantiating everything at the top of this page. Ideally you would have some kind of MVC structure, or you would include this in a separate file, but bear in mind you do need to instantiate a new validator object every time you want to perform validation, so it's best to do that for within each controller method, or however you're working with this, or on every page if you're just doing all your logic at the top of the page. So really what we need to do is start creating our classes in here. So I'm going to create a classes folder within my root directory. At the moment we've just got this index.php. It's literally just submitting through to the same page and not doing anything. So inside of classes, let's create a couple of files. The first is the dependency that we spoke about. This is the error handler. So I'm going to create a file called errorhandler.php. And let's create another file. This is going to be our main validator. So we're going to call this validator.php. So we're obviously matching the class name to the file name. So inside of validator, let's start to define this class out. So this is a class of validator. Now we're going to have various properties and methods in here, but we'll go over them shortly. The first thing we want to do is inject the error handler into this class, and this is called dependency injection. It means that we can use the error handler separately, and this class doesn't depend on instantiating a new error handler instance. Sounds confusing, but it basically just means we're putting this error handler into the validator to be able to use its functionality. So let's define this out as well, and we'll call this error handler, and that's about it. So inside of validator, let's create our constructor method. Now the constructor method runs when this is instantiated, and it's going to take an error handler in here. Now we can type hint this just to make sure that we do get an instance of error handler passed in, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create a protected method function up here, and we're going to call this error handler. So this is just going to be called error handler, and what we're going to do here is we're going to say this error handler, and we're going to assign that the value that's passed in. So now what we can do is we can instantiate this, and we can instantiate this as well. So let's just require these files in and do that now. So we're going to do a require once on classes errorhandler.php, and we're going to do a require once on classes validator.php. So now what we can do is we can create a new instance of our error handler. So let's create a variable called error handler, and we'll assign this new error handler. That's it. Now we're going to say validator equals new validator, and we want to pass in the error handler, and that's it. So what we'll do is we will only instantiate this if we are seeing elements within our post superglobal. So let's move this just up here and indent that. So after this happens, we can then start to use our methods available in validator. And the first one is checking if the data is available, or sort of checking and providing in the rules. So we want to look something like this. We want to say validation. So we're creating a new variable called validation, and that's going to be validator check. So we're checking, we're using the check method on validator. We don't actually have that available, so let's create that now. This is a public function, so it can be publicly accessed, called check, and this takes two parameters. The first is the items that we want to check, so i.e. the post superglobal, or an array that you want to pass in yourself. So you could technically say something like username Alex, for example, and that's obviously an associative array, but I'm just going to basically pass in post. Then comes an array. If you're using an earlier version of PHP, you might have to use array like this, but I'm going to be using the shorthand notation, which is 2 square brackets. And then here comes an associative array of multiple checks, basically, for each item. And these are going to be called the rules, so we're going to call these rules. So we're referring to each item as items and each rule as rules. So what we want to do within here is loop through all of the items that we're given. So that includes those in the post superglobal. So let's say for each, so we do a for each loop on this, and we're going to say for each of the items passed in, and we're going to grab the key, which we're going to call item, and then we're going to grab the value within that. So just for now, let's echo out item and value. And let's see what this does. So we will just get rid of rules for now. In fact, we'll keep rules. And we'll just pass in this empty array. So let's check what this does. If we just refresh here and hit submit, you can see we get username, email, and password. They are basically the names of each of the items. So what we're doing now is we are seeing, basically the reason we didn't see any values here is because we don't have any. So if we were to provide some details in here, you can see that that will give us the username, which is the name of the field, the value, the next name of the field, the value, and so on. So we know that we've got access to these now. And these are both useful because obviously we need to know the keys of each of the items that are passed into check. We can sort of correspond them with what we specify in here. So for example, username, and then we give an array of values. So I think the best thing to do here is probably actually define out the rules as well. Because then we can pass them over to another method within our validator for them to be checked. So let's just make up the rules for each of these items here. Let's say that we want the username to be required. So we're going to say true. Let's also say we want this to have a max length of 20. Let's say that's stored in our database with a max length of 20. So that makes sense. Obviously, this makes sense to have a minimum length because we don't want people entering 1 character usernames. We're going to have an email as well. So this is just going to be required again. And we also want to say that this is an email. So we're going to validate this as an email passing in true. Bear in mind, none of this functionality exists at all at the moment. Let's also give this, I guess, a max length. Let's say we were storing it at 255 in our database. We wouldn't want it to exceed that. And the password as well. This is good for validation. We can say that we want this to be required. So pretty much all of our fields are required. And we also can specify a minimum length just to make people, I guess, enforce some kind of password security. So regardless of why we're doing this, we've created what we want to happen. This is the functionality that we want. So inside of validator, after we've looped through each of the items, what we want to do is we want to check basically whether the values that are passed in our post data or whatever is passed in here are actually available here. Because if, for example, we post in, username, email, and password, and we forget the password here, that's perfectly reasonable. We might not want to validate that. We might just want to say, well, it's not required. There's no specific length or validation we want to apply to it. Let's leave it out. Therefore, we don't want to include it in the check. So we're going to have an if statement in here to check whether this is in the rules array. So we take the item, which remember is the key name, and we want to check whether it's in one of these. And we do that by using the array keys function, which will basically return the keys from an array. Makes sense? So in this case, the rules, which are all of these, would basically give back an array with username, email, and password, and then that checks it against that. So now what we want to do is pass it to a validator within our validator, or a validate method within our validator. So we're going to say this validate. Now we're going to basically put a few things into an array here. The reason we're passing this off to another method is because it makes sense to break things up. Here we're doing a couple of checks, we're looping through each item, and we're calling another method. This method would get way too long if we didn't break it up. So that's why we're doing it here. So we're going to say that we want the field to be the item. Remember, this is the field name. We echoed that out earlier. We're going to provide a value to the validate method as well, and that's just going to be the value, which is obviously here. That could be, my password, my email address. And we also then want to provide the rules, and we say rules and then item, and that's the reason we did this check in the first place, because otherwise this wouldn't be set. So this item corresponds to username, email, and password, and therefore we're just passing the rules here. So these arrays, we're passing these arrays along with the data and the field name to the validate method. So let's create this method here. It's going to be a protected method because we don't need to access it from outside of this class, obviously unless we have inheritance. But this is going to be called validate, and this is going to take in some data. So we're just going to call this item. Okay, so in here, we're not going to do too much either. We don't want to overload the amount of checking we do in here or anything like that. The first thing I want to do is I want to extract the field name because I'm going to use it a couple of times later. So I'm just going to say item field. Remember, that's this that we pushed into this method earlier. So now what we want to do is we want to loop through each rule. We've already looped through each item, and then we're calling this validate method for each item. But now what we want to do for, say, username, we want to loop through all of these rules. For email, we want to loop through all of these rules. So what we want to do is, again, do a for each. But this time we want to loop through item rules, and this is going to be as rule. Now this is the rule name, so this is required, max length, min length, email, or whatever else you want to extend this with, and this is going to bring in a satisfier. Now the satisfier is what satisfies that this rule has been met. So for example, the max length, the satisfier is 20. The value passed in here to this must be a maximum of 20 characters long. So what we now want to do is think about this. We need a set of allowed rules. The reason being is because we're going to be dynamically calling methods. So I'm going to not do all the validation in here. I'm going to create separate methods for each piece of validation. So whether it's required or not, whether it's a max or min length, email, exists in the database or whatever. So we need to create a little if statement here, and we need to use the inArray function to check if the rule is within a set of rules allowed. And if this isn't quite clear just now, don't worry too much. It will become clearer later when you see how we're going to be dynamically calling these. So we're going to say if inArray rule this rules. Now this rules is an array which doesn't quite exist yet. So let's go ahead and create this up here. So protected rules. This is just going to be an array of method names that exist within this this class. Now we could see if say the rule name is callable, but that doesn't stop us passing in fields that will call this check method. And again, if this is a little bit confusing, don't worry, it will become clear later when we build this out. So we're going to have required, min length, max length, and email. So let's populate this here. So required, min length, max length, and email. Simple as that. So only if this rule exists will it work. So I'm just, for purpose of testing, I'm going to echo out rule, perhaps append a break onto there. And you can see that now what's going to happen is when I submit, we get for each one. So this is for username, this is for email, and this is for password. We get each of them output. However, if we neglect to include required in this array, you will see that we omit the required then. So that's now not checking required. So once we know that this is going to be called, we could also check if it's callable. That's up to you whether you put that in. But what we're now going to do is we're going to call or use a function in PHP called callUserFuncArray. Now this could be confusing if you've never come across it before. But what we're going to do is we're going to check for a return value on a method within our class. So actually, let's leave this out for now because it can easily become confusing. Let's now define all of the methods that we need to check required, min length, max length, and email. So these are all going to be protected because we don't need to access these outside. So we're going to say required. Now, each of these methods that we create are going to take in the actual field in case we need the field name, the value, and of course the satisfier. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to, for required, it's fairly straightforward. We need to provide field, value, and satisfier anyway, but we don't actually need all of these. We just need the value. Now here what we're doing is we're checking if a value is not empty. So I'm going to return, if not empty, value. And we may also want to trim this as well, just to remove any white space. So that's checking if that value is required. You may want to do additional checks in here, it's entirely up to you, but that's now done. So when we call this method inside of here, and we're going to be calling that based on the rule name. So if the rule name is required, that will call the method called required. If the rule name similarly is, let's do min length, then if the rule name is min length, that will call inside of here min length. So this is basically how it works. So let's now just start to call what we need in here. So we are going to use the call user func array. Now what's going to happen is for each of these methods, they're always going to return true or false. They're going to return a boolean. So we're going to say if not, this means the return value from these functions. So we're going to call user func array. This takes, we're going to get rid of this actually because that's a little misleading. We're going to pass in an array for the class or the object that we want to call. In this case, it's this object and this rule. So now what this method is doing is it's calling this, meaning this validator class, and it's calling this rule as a method name. So for example, the first one is required. This line here will call this method. The second time round we get max length. That will then call a method called max length. It just means that we don't have to do a switch statement or an if statement to check each one and create basically more code than we need to. So let's define now the rest of the rules and then we'll test if these actually work and make sure we've not done anything wrong here. So for the value and the satisfier, for the min length, again, fairly straightforward. We return the string length, and I'm using mbstrlen value. So if the string length of this is greater than or equal to the satisfier, that means that we have fulfilled the minimum length. And we can literally just copy and paste the min length and switch this in for max length. And that does exactly the same thing, except that it is less than or equal to. So if this is less than or equal to the satisfier, that means that it's fulfilled the fact that it's not exceeding the max length. And finally, we have a method called email, which does the same thing here. It has the same arguments, and we are returning, we're using the filter var function in PHP. We're passing in the value and the constant here, which defines a valid email address. So there are our methods. Now these are calling each of the method. So let's just echo out OK here, just for the sake of it, just see what's happening here. So I'm going to refresh and click continue. Oh, okay. So we've missed out something in our call user func array method, and that is a second parameter of the arguments. So we need to pass these arguments through to these methods. So in this case, it's just another array, and we need to pass through the field, the value, and the satisfier. So in this case, it's the field. For the value, it's literally just item value. Remember, that's what we passed in with our value with our array into here. And last but not least, we have the satisfier, and that is defined here as part of the rules. So let's again just refresh here and click continue. Okay, so this all says okay. I should have, that's a little bit misleading. I should have failed like this. And depending on how many we have here, if we just append a break, you'll see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if we look back in our index, we've got a max length here of 255, so that wouldn't have failed. And we've got a max length here of 20, which wouldn't have failed. That leaves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that leaves us with the 6 failed. That means that the failed has returned 6 times, and it looks like we're on good track to this actually, returning the results we need. But it's no use just doing something here. What we need to do is we need to store the error messages associated with the current rule being checked. And for this, we're going to pull in the error handler, which we haven't even touched yet. This is fairly straightforward. The error handler just basically allows us to store errors, add errors, return all errors, check if the errors actually exist, and also grab the first error from a specific rule or specific field rather. So let's create this error handler and see this in action. So we're going to have a errors array here, and we're leaving this or automatically assigning this with an empty array because it could there could be no errors added. So we want to use the empty method on this to check if it contains any values. Now what we're interested in doing here is allowing errors to be added. So this should be add error. So adding an error means we pass in an error message, but we also want to optionally allow a key to be specified to group these. And by grouping them, I mean if we want to add an error specifically for the username, that means that we can provide the key of username. And the reason that we're doing this but also not allowing or not requiring this is because you can use this error handler elsewhere in your application. We don't want to specifically tie this down to what we're doing within our validator. That's bad practice. So to add an error, the first thing we want to do is check if the key actually exists. So we're going to say if key. Now if a key does exist, we want to say this errors, remember this is that array up here, and we want to add an error within this specific key. An error is basically just going to be a string. So we could say something like, let's just give an example down here, let's say error handler. In fact, we can actually demonstrate this because it's completely separate. We can actually do this. So let's just comment this out. So the error handler here, we're going to say error handler, add error, and we're going to add, oops, that is not valid, just as an example, and then we can add it under the key of username. And that means that if we add, say, another error here, another one down here, and another one down here, we can say something like too short, and under, say, email and password, we can say invalid email. And we're going to be doing all of this within our validator class, remember. So this isn't completely wasted functionality, and you can use it elsewhere as well. So I could say password not strong enough. It could be anything. So now what we can actually do is, inside of our validator, bear in mind this is what we're going to be doing inside of inside of our error handler, if the key hasn't been provided, we just want to add that into the errors like that, as a normal string. We're not going to be doing that in this case. We always want to provide a key. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a method which checks if errors do exist. So we're going to return if there is a positive count on this all, which we haven't created, we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to return false. This is just a ternary operator. If this is positive, we're returning a true. Otherwise, we're returning a false. That's all that does. So this all method that we are using within our hasErrors method, if we do a public all function here, which we are allowing to be used outside. Remember earlier we looked at using our validator fails method and returning all errors. What this is going to do is it's going to also allow an optional key to be passed in. We might want to get all errors, as in all errors for the username, email and password, but we may also want to get all errors just for the username or just for the password. So what we're going to do now is we're going to return, and we're going to do another ternary operator. We're checking if this errors key is set. If it is set, then we want to return all errors under that key. So this errors key. Now otherwise, we just want to return all the errors. We're just going to assume that that is not available. So now hasErrors should return true or false. So what do we think is going to happen if I do a var dump on error handler hasErrors? Let's take a look and refresh, and we get a true. Now if we were to just temporarily get rid of these, we get false. So we know that that's now working. So this is allowing us to add errors and then check if errors are available. But what about the other functionality that makes this a little bit more rich? In this case, it's first. And this allows us to get the first error within a particular key. So we're going to create a method here called first, and that's always going to have a key. We always want to provide a key in there, so we don't need to default sign it to null. So we're going to return, again, we're going to do a ternary operator here and return something. So what we're going to do is we're going to check if this all at the specified key and the first error on that key exists. So for example, if there were 2 username errors and we said we want to get the first result from username, we're then saying, is the first error available? I.e., does it have anything? Now if it does, we want to return this all at key at position 0. Otherwise, we're going to return false. So we're returning mixed from here. We're either returning a string or the value false. And this just lets us, I mean, what we could do really is we just return an empty string, and that would keep things a bit more consistent. We're either returning a string here or an empty string, so we can use this in an if statement if we really want to. You can keep it as false, it's entirely up to you. So now let's check this out and see if this actually works. So let's start to put this into an if statement. We're going to say if error handler has errors, then I'm going to say, oh, I want to get the first username error. In that case, it's oops, this is not valid. So I'm going to say echo error handler first username. So that should give me oops, that is not valid. Cool. If this was switched around the other way, it will tell me too short. There we are. Cool, so that works. Now let's try it on the all method. And it might help that we wrap this in pre-tags. That just gives us this output with line breaks, which makes things a lot easier to see. Oh, we need to do a print R on that. And there we go. So we've got all of the errors in with our keys, along with our keys, and there we are. Now, bear in mind if we're not using keys, let's just get rid of these again temporarily. We would literally just see a list of errors, which is perfectly fine. You may want to use that for this reason. So we've now got this. We may again want to get all from username. We've already built this functionality, and that will just give us them too that relate to the username. So we've got this all working. We can get rid of all of this except our error handler instantiation, and we can start to bring this back now. So what I'm now going to do is start to use the error handler inside of the validator. Remember earlier when we constructed, we passed this in as a dependency and we stored it up here. So inside of back to our call user func array, if a false value is returned from any of these, that means there's an error. So we want to then go ahead and store an error. So I'm going to say this error handler. We're calling this exactly like we did just a moment ago on index, but we're calling it from within validator. So we're going to add an error. Now remember, again, this takes an error, so an error string, and it takes a namespace or a key if you like. So for example, username. We can't obviously hard code that because we're looping through each of the values. In this case though, we want to store it in the field. Remember, we passed the field through for each of the fields and we obtained it here. That's then passed into there. So this will be username for the first loop, this will be email for the second, and password for the third. Now for adding the actual error, this is a little bit more tricky, so I'm going to pull this down just so we can concentrate a little bit more on this. So I'm pulling that down. What we're going to do here is something slightly tricky. We are going to, because bear in mind we need to provide an error for each field, but we want to say the username field is empty. We can't hard code anything in here because we're doing this dynamically. So we need to store a list of errors up here. So we can do that within a public, we could call this errors, I suppose, or messages would be better. Now this is going to be an array of strings. It's going to be an associative array. So for required, I'm going to choose the message that I want to output. And because I've set this as a public, this means that this can be changed. It can come from a config, it can be overridden. You can expand this if you need that functionality, but the likelihood is that you'll probably just come in here and edit it. So for required, I'm going to say the field. This is a placeholder. This will change. This could be the username field is required, the password field is required, the email, the bio, whatever you're choosing as your field name. This needs to be flexible. So we're going to say the field is required. And we're going to be using str replace to replace this in a moment. So for min length, this is a similar deal, but this time we want to also replace in the satisfier. So we're going to say the field must be a minimum of satisfier length. And we'll do a similar thing for max length here as well. So let's just grab this and paste this down here. So it must be a maximum of, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the last one is the email. And again, if you're creating your own options, you can extend this. That is not a valid email address. That's a pretty straightforward one. Okay, so we've got these messages here, but how are we going to grab these values and replace in these placeholders? Well, that's fairly straightforward. We're going to use str replace. Now, str replace takes a needle, which is what you're looking for. It takes a haystack, which is what you are looking for in, and it takes a needle, a replacement, and a where you're replacing, basically. So for this, what we're doing is we're passing in arrays rather than single values, and we're looking within this messages rule. So for example, in this first loop, let's say the rule is required. That will grab this value here. So this string now is under replacement, and we want to replace the values in here, field, satisfier, and we want to replace them with the field, which we get from here, and the satisfier, which we get from here. So let's say, for example, this is a username. We are saying required true max length min length. So this whole thing, as we know, let's pull this over. This whole thing we know is going to loop or be called. This method is going to be called 3 times. For the first time round, this field will be username, which obviously will remain the same for each time it loops. But this will change. This rule will change. So we'll get this string for required max length and min length. We'll replace in the field and the satisfier, and then that will be added to the errors if this, as we've already discussed, is invalid. So what we now want to do is, obviously within our validator, we want to introduce some more methods that will check whether or not errors have occurred. So we've stored these errors now, so now we need to check them. So let's create a public function called errors. Now what this is going to do is it's going to do something slightly different. We're not actually going to return the errors. We're going to return this error handler. Handler. So let's test this out. So we don't have a fails method yet, so we can't do anything here. But what we're going to do is I'm going to do a var dump on validation errors. This will give me a error handler object. Oh, okay, so let's have a look here. Okay. So what's happened here is I'm basically trying to chain on a method, because we've already called this check method here, but the check method doesn't actually return anything, and it should return this. So by returning this, it returns the entire object, and therefore I can chain on methods like errors. So when I refresh now, you can see that we get this error handler object back, and it's got all the errors in here. So we know all the errors are being stored. You can actually see now the fruit of our labor. The username field is required. That is not a valid email address. The password field is required. The password field must be a minimum of 6 length. So we can see here with such little work, by doing this and this check down here, we've actually created quite a powerful system. So instead of errors, what we want to do is we also want to have a fails method. So we can do something more correctly down here, and we can say something like if validation fails, so this will return a boolean. Then I'm going to do a print R on validation errors all. Remember, by calling all on errors, what we're actually doing is we're calling all on an error handler. So we're referring to this method inside of here, all. So let's just tidy this up a little bit and do a wrap in pre-tags. And inside of validator now, we want to implement this fails method. So this is going to return this error handler and has errors. And this is obviously implemented in here, which returns a boolean. So this therefore is going to return a boolean. So now, if the validator fails, we're outputting the errors from the error handler. So let's check this out, hit submit, and we get this array here. And we can change this up like we saw before with username inside of all, and that will only return us with the username errors. And we can also call the first method on a particular field, like so. So with actually very little code, we've managed to create a validator which you can extend your validation requirements. We've implemented a separate error handler, which is used inside of validator as a dependency. Now, extending your validation rules are as simple as adding it to our protected rules, which, by the way, earlier we discussed, may not make sense. The reason being here is, for example, if I was, I don't know, from a security point of view, I was, creating some validation rules, etc., and I wanted to say, I don't know, check in here. Now, because we've got check written in here, what that's actually going to do then is call, it's not really from a security point of view, it's more from a sort of correctness point of view or a consistency point of view. That would then call this method because we're calling methods on the fly. So we do that just to make sure that they're available. And like I said earlier, you can use is callable as well, checking if the method is callable. Anyway, adding your own validation is as simple as just taking one of these messages and creating it for yourself and whatever the validation rule is. What we can also then do, or what you should also then do, is add a new item in here. And then obviously you would create a new method. And that would basically just do your check and return true, false, or whatever. And it would then replace the field and the satisfier fields that are input here. So with that, we've created the base for a very simple validation class that can be easily extended.